You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson, and I'm here with Kevin Gray today, and on my show, Author to Author. How are you today, Kevin?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, would you like to open us with prayer?
Certainly. I thought I would lead us in the Serenity Prayer, which actually I'll connect to to my book. So let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. In the Father, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Truer words were never spoken. Yeah. So tell us how, what it is exactly that led you to write this book.
Sure. So I am a philosopher of education, and I actually did my dissertation on Kierkegaard, and an existentialist. He's concerned with things like despair and boredom and meaning and purpose. And for me, boredom just brings up so many interesting questions, questions really about meaning and purpose and human flourishing. When I share with colleagues and friends, I'm writing a book on boredom, the response that I inevitably hear is, wow, that sounds really interesting, which is really kind of amusing to me, because boredom is, defined as a state of disinterest.
Yeah.
And yet I think it's a topic of great interest. And certainly in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of interest in the research in this topic. And I think it really pertains to questions about human flourishing. And even become more advanced in so many ways. Questions about human flourishing still perplex and baffle us. And we look for answers, drawing on our Catholic tradition, we look for answers that go way back to these questions, as well as from more contemporary sources. And so my interest in this project is really an interest in what does it mean to flourish as a human being? Approaching this from the vantage point of education, I have gotten to teach a lot of students, and as a high school teacher and as a college teacher, I would describe boredom as kind of the elephant in the room that you're trying to, chase out and avoid. And so one of the ways that we respond to boredom, and I think culturally we're conditioned to do this, is to avoid it, to find any way we can to steer clear of it. And so kind of the symbol of that would be the iPhone, the smartphone that gives us access to everything all the time. And so I find that to be a real problematic way to contend with boredom, but it's one that we do instinctively, intuitively. We were conditioned to avoid boredom. An example of this in education, I remember when I was taking my son to kindergarten, his first day at a school. It was actually a Catholic school, and we went in the room, and there were stations set up with chairs, about four or five students to a station, and at each desk there was an iPad ready for them. The very first day of school. And frankly, as an educator who thinks about boredom and boredom avoidance, I was kind of distraught by that right out of the gate, the teacher was going to give them a device to kind of, I think that they described this phenomena as edutainment. If we can just keep them stimulated and engaged and amused, we can outrun boredom altogether. And this sets up a lot of problems later in life, not just later, but even presently, because a lot of the ways we avoid boredom are very problematic. Some of them are frittering time away on things that are perhaps not as meaningful as when we think about our better self, playing Scrabble for 3 hours or solitaire on our computer or gaming may not be what our better self is calling us to. So boredom avoidance has subtler infractions, but it also leads to all kinds of even more problematic behaviors. You think of overeating, gambling, addiction, all kinds of problems. Student misconduct are linked to boredom avoidance. So it's just this problem that's rife in schools, and students report rates of boredom continue to be quite high, especially in the upper grades, in spite of the fact that we have all of this technology to engage and stimulate us. And so on the one hand, you've got boredom avoidance. The other response that I see to boredom is I would describe it as kind of boredom endurance, where you're conditioned to just accept boredom as a fact of life. And so I'm thinking of sort of the grown-up, telling a child who says, I'm bored, we'll get used to it. Life is boring, and there are going to be boring parts of your job, and you just need to learn to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And I describe that as kind of a resignation. And I'm always amazed, in visiting lots of classrooms. I'd be in classrooms and just as an adult with some internal resources, I'm like, wow, this is so boring to me right now. I'm just having a hard time sitting still here. And I'm always amazed. Oftentimes the students just seem to be so compliant and docile. And I'm almost wanting them to start a revolution or create some kind of, disturbance. Yeah. But I think this is the other kind of, these two different responses, avoidance and endurance. This endurance, or this sort of accepting it, they become conditioned to just expect less and to accept situations that are tedious in ways that are not engaging, not meaningful. And so what I think is needed is stepping back from both of those responses, either avoidance or resignation, and really acquiring some practical wisdom about how to address this mood state. And there are occasions when challenging boredom is entirely appropriate. You think about someone who's talking and monologuing ad nauseum at you, asking a question, interrupting them, even being direct and say, you've been talking a long time here. Can I get a word in? And so learning how to engage with boredom. And there are other times when you do need to just push through this uncomfortable mood state, because, getting good at anything, you think about learning a language, learning an instrument, requires being able to contend with these lulls, these boring, dull points, to get proficient at something. And so acquiring a relationship with boredom requires practical wisdom. Boredom is it's difficult to define, but it is a mood state. And you think about a mood like anger, and we lose our temper, for example, or we indulge in pursuing a pleasure, and we drink too much, and we kind of get evidence, or we get indicators right away that, wow, I need to figure out how to relate to this or respond to this mood in a more constructive way. And boredom is tricky because boredom can fly under the radar. We can be avoiding boredom and really never learning how to respond in a way that's wise. And so that's where I'm talking about practical wisdom. And part of this is recognizing the distinction that Martin Heidegger draws between situational and existential boredom. Situational boredom, you think about being in a class that's boring, or waiting in a line at the post office, and the situation is it's going to pass. You want it to pass, and eventually it will. Existential boredom, though, is a more profound boredom, and that's where you are trying to find something that will engage and interest you and hopefully bring meaning to your life, and you're really coming up short. And so this is a much more troubling kind of boredom. Leo Tolstoy describes it as a desire for desires. With situational boredom, you desire the situation to end. With existential boredom, you're not even sure what's even worth desiring. And so that's where, really recognizing I could be moving from situation to situation and not realizing that there's a deeper existential boredom that I'm struggling with. So, Cynthia, that was a very long answer to your very brief question, but those are the kind of things that animated this book and I write about. And the first part is really about boredom, but then the second part is really about then how do we respond to this troubling mood state? And that's where I turn to questions about leisure and cultivating leisure. So
as you were talking, I was thinking how lucky I am, because I am I can't even remember the last time I was bored.
Mm.
But that's because I always have something to do, I think, or I'm thinking about something or writing something or making something. But I'm wondering, as you were talking about it, and this may not be something that's of interest to you, but is there like some kind of chemical imbalance that leads some people to have like really bad boredom symptoms, and the majority of us just on occasion might get bored?
There are lots of studies, especially in the field of psychology, that look at this distinction between trait and state boredom. And trait boredom is considering certain people dispositionally are more prone to boredom, which is what I think you're getting at. And state boredom is depending upon the situation, we can find ourselves being more prone to boredom, and that's work that is still being sorted out. There really is not, this is obviously not a precise science, because boredom,
Right.
it's a curious mood in that it's both subjective and objective, and by that I mean that when you say you're bored, you're saying something about your environment, that this environment is unstimulating, uninteresting to me. But it's also saying something subjective. It's uninteresting to you, but it might be very stimulating or engaging to someone else. And so that's where it really can vary from person to person. But this is where we need, later in the book, I talk about we really need mentors and community and friends to check our tendency to say something is boring. When we describe something as boring, I'm imagining our arms folded, and it's kind of a dismissive description of something. This is a boring book, or this is a boring poem, a boring activity. When in fact it could actually be very interesting. And if we talk with someone who is into this, I mentioned the example of chess. I don't find chess particularly interesting. But to call it boring would be dismissive, because if I were to talk to friends who are really interested in chess, they could explain to me what's going on, and I might see that there's actually a lot there to be very interested and engaged with. There's a lot of even drama in the game of chess. And so boredom is this subjective, objective mood that tells us something about the world, but also tells us something about ourselves. And we really need friends to help guide us, to check our tendency to label something as boring or not boring. But in terms of the actual science of we do know that some folks that struggle with attention, and some of that is biochemical, does make them more prone to being bored. And the problem with the bored mind is, this is drawing on Aquinas, it tends to be kind of a roving mind. It's looking for some novel stimuli. It's just not satisfied with what's in front of it. And part of that really does impair then our ability to pay attention and to be present to whatever it is we have to do. I actually just the other day, 2 days ago, got a copy of the book, and I'm going to show it to you.
Yeah.
I was able, thankfully, to select the cover, and this is Vermeer's The Milkmaid. What I love about Vermeer's work is there's a contemplative focus to the work, and so everything in this painting draws you to this activity of pouring milk, and there's a presence there, and you see her eyes, and even the way her arms are drawn to the picture. Everything sort of focuses the attention. And so one of the key remedies for addressing the bored mind is learning to cultivate attention anew. This is where our distracting technologies really do a disservice, because they set us up to just constantly be distracted. I see this with my students all the time. And one of the things I've created in my classroom is I've asked them to opt out of using their phones altogether. And so I actually give them an extra point at the end of the semester on their overall grade if they turn their phone off and put it in a box in the corner of the room. And really, that's just to check our tendency to be distracted from distraction by distraction, to quote T.S. Eliot. We just, and that's really the bored. The bored mind is a distractible mind that's constantly roving around for some new stimuli. And what is needed is, you mentioned not being a person who's bored, and I suspect you've found several things that are meaningful that you attend to and enjoy, and that's what we need to guide ourselves into, as well as our students. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a large family. I have 30 descendants, and of course I'm old. That's why I have so many. But anyway, so I have 30 descendants, and a home, and I work. So it's like, I'm always on the go, and so I don't ever. I can't say I've never been bored, but I can't remember the last time I was. It seems to be a thing of balance. When you're talking about the effect of the phone, and I agree with you, it's like if you start looking at the phone for too long, it's like the images just are constantly changing, and you can get a million opinions, none of which are worth much. But it's the misuse of a really good tool. Like I'm on my cell phone talking to you hundreds of miles away, and so it's an issue of making sure that things are used for what they should be. And sure, you can be entertained. I mean, I look at YouTubes on occasion, but I look at YouTubes to learn too. So new computer technology, something like that. But balance is sorely missing in our lives in this country. And I think that may be part of it. It's like we seem to differentiate between fun, which should be all the time, and a little bit of work. And during that time, if you don't have anything to do, you're going to get bored. And I just don't know. That's how I look when I look at my kids, my grandkids, and my great grandkids. It's like they have to have something to do all the time. It has to be something that entertains.
Yeah, I think that the difference that I in writing the book, the difference between avoiding boredom versus cultivating leisure.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this state of mind where I'm avoiding boredom, and that tends to be kind of a passive posture, really, where we can be very vulnerable to the larger marketing forces that actually benefit from us being bored. I mean, there are a lot of kitchens that have been torn out because people are bored. I mean, there are landfills full of stuff that could have been used for another 10 years, but we just got bored with it, and so we needed to renovate. And so there's a problem of consumption, of overconsumption, that is connected to this avoidance of boredom, versus a cultivating of leisure, which is really a way of beholding, and it's also a way of enjoying simple things as a remedy or therapeutic response to boredom. In the book, I actually draw on a Catholic philosopher, theologian, Joseph Pieper.
Oh, sure.
His notion of leisure is really drawing on this idea of the Sabbath and Sabbath rest.
Mm-hmm.
And our week is full of activity, and what the Sabbath is at its best is learning how not to be. It's not marked by activity so much as it's marked by receptivity. Learning how to have a receptive posture. Pieper makes this distinction, drawing on Aquinas, this distinction between two minds, the what he calls the ratio mind, which is busy and active and sizes things up and questions and interrogates and is kind of striving, versus the intellectus mind, which is a capacity for beholding, for enjoying, for receiving. And it's this intellectus capacity that we can lose, and we're constantly working hard and striving, and then we need a rest. And so rather than cultivating intellectus beholding, what we're prompted to do, and this is where I get into this idea of by leisure, I'm certainly not talking about vacation, amusement, distraction,
right?
Which can be more like we've had a long day and we just want to kind of veg out, and I completely get that. But there's this philosopher, Albert Borgman. He talks about instead of activities that are about vegging out and escaping, he's looking at how what he describes as focal practices can restore the soul in ways that are more neutral. And so he actually uses the example of cooking or going for a walk, chopping firewood. These tend to be more embodied things that you're using your hands and you're moving versus screen time. And it's a form of leisure that opens us up to being receptive, this intellectus versus the striving. And it takes work to do it, but once we do it, it restores us in a much more profound way. And so and that's where, people who have a habit of going for walks understand that people who go for hikes. And so part of the response to the bored mind is cultivating noble forms of leisure. That's the balance that really the Catholic tradition talks about. And actually, Pope Francis in one of his first encyclicals, Laudate Si, let us praise, which is, on the one hand, it in the media, it was all about the environment, and it certainly is about being a great steward, a thoughtful steward of the environment. Actually, he has a lot to say about leisure, and he talks about a person of leisure is really a person who can enjoy each moment and is not on the lookout for new things, but really appreciates simple things, friends and nature. It's that more leisurely receptive way of being that is the balance that is hard to get to, but that's the kind of balance that we're striving for. I agree with you. These tools, our phones, our Zooming right now, they're incredible tools, but they also can draw us into a boredom avoidance. Walker Percy described modern life as a boredom avoidance scheme, and it can really draw us into that sort of frittering on the surface rather than the kind of attending that Pieper and Francis talk about. So.
Oh, it's interesting, but things are misused all the time. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the phone, our new phones, which are such an incredible advance in technology, are being used. Yeah. But I guess that's really the way it goes with all technology, isn't it? There's always some abuse of it.
There is. I think this is a friend of mine described this as fruit flies in an experiment. I mean, it seems like these new technologies are coming and they're so disruptive to the way we live and view the world that it's hard to even get our bearings. And so, in this book, I didn't want it to be a screed against technology. Really, what I was trying to do was illuminate the problem of boredom avoidance and to cast a vision of as a real part of human flourishing. And so the key then is how do we rein the technology in so that we're not having our attention so fragmented. There's this loss of what is called deep literacy, this being able to read a text in a way that lets the text speak to us. I had a professor in college who one time said to my class, we were sophomores at the time, sophomores are wise fools, and we were complaining about, I think it was a Shakespeare play, and he said, you don't judge the text judges you and finds you severely lacking. And I always loved that quote. I mean, at the time I was quite annoyed by it, but it really pointed to there's something here worth listening to, and it may appear boring, but you need to sit with this. You need to push through this boring state and find that there's something of intrinsic value here. And that's really what that's the kind of the seeds of leisure. There's a great quote by G.K. Chesterton. Anything worth doing is worth doing poorly. And one of the ways to think about leisure is to think about becoming really good at a sport or a language or an instrument. And leisure is about cultivating a receptivity and enjoying what you're doing. And so often when we're trying to perfect something, we no longer enjoy it. I see this with kids, especially in sports. The demands are so great that they lose sight of the actual, enjoyment of what it is they're doing. And to be a person of leisure is to be mindful and receptive to that. And so even if you're doing it poorly, even if, I like to play tennis, even though I play tennis poorly, or even though I bake bread poorly, I enjoy it. I enjoy the process and the activity. And you're trying to recognize that while it's happening is really, that's the kind of spirit of leisure that it's quite delicate and fragile. And really what we're talking about are really the, Paul says to pray unceasingly, and to be a person of leisure is to be, in a sense, a person of prayer in all that you're doing. So, I used to live near the Amish when I lived in Goshen, Indiana. So the report is that, the Amish are anti-technology, and my colleague who's a Mennonite said, no, they're not anti-technology. They're actually just very thoughtful about technology. Have a rich community life, and whenever there's a new technology, the question they ask is, how is this going to change our community life together? So you'll see Amish, driving cars or being driven in cars or even using phones, but they're always guided by the question of how is this going to disrupt our community? And if it does, then we need to really think carefully about how we're going to use this technology. And that's the kind of thoughtfulness that, unfortunately, we don't see that in so much of our schools. Google's a very powerful corporation, and schools have tended to buy in. This is going back to the 30s. They tend to buy into all the technology that's out there as implicit good and advancing our culture and our civilization. And we need to be more thoughtful about that. This was always, amusing to me when I would go to, there was a nearby Walmart. And I remember being there with my 3, 5, and 2-year-old at the time. And you'd see Amish families. And it was always striking, when you get up the checkout line, Walmart has this incredible display of color and candy and treats and trinkets, and they're all at about 2 to 3 foot high. So it's perfectly designed for children to have a meltdown, demanding that their parents get them this or that. And it's really quite diabolical as a parent. I'm furious. Why have they created this situation where we're waiting in the line and my kids are getting bored, and their response to boredom is, I'm going to grab candy or this toy. And it was striking to see the Amish children on the line next to me, and they were just quietly standing there, and they're, and really there's just two different cultures there and two different ways of responding to kind of the bored self that needs something to satiate, and always kind of marveled at that and envy. And I would try to bring some Amish wisdom into my home, not always, somewhat short-lived, but remember removing tech, would have weekends where there'd be no tech, no screens. And I was always amazed at, as soon as I did that, the kids would start building forts, they'd start doing experiments. And so there's an activation of the imagination that can happen when you remove all this super stimuli and narrow down the options. So.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see. I mean, where you have technology, the problem isn't just the technology, it's the profit that it's generating.
Yes.
And so there always has to be something new that's, may not actually be all that new, but it has enough of a change in it that people want it. So there's always that profit motive.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And, people want the latest. I drive a car that's like 12 years old. My feeling is it still goes. Now it stops going. I will buy new car because that should last me for the rest of my life. But people always want something new. So it's not, and I think that the kind of technology you're talking about, what it is that it does draw people away into that isolation of looking at a screen. And they're getting better and better at it.
They are, and the algorithms that track our clicks and our appetites, and then present things to us. I mean, that's something that we're all having to contend with. It's interesting, though. A century ago, the national report is called the Cardinal Principles Report of 1918, cast a vision for secondary education. And it had 7 objectives. These are the 7 kind of goals that we should aim for as we educate our students in high school. And one of the objectives was the cultivation of leisure.
Mm-hmm.
And by leisure, they really were connecting to this greater tradition of Sabbath wisdom, of learning to enjoy things and to enjoy it in a way that didn't require overconsumption, or even, plans for the curriculum and leisure directors to be in schools and it wasn't just leisure in our, you think of like sort of the hobbies of art and music. It was also, how do you do math and science with the spirit of leisure? 100 years later in our national vision for education, that kind of vision is completely absent. We're based on really competing in a global race. And so, it's not surprising to me that that's disappeared, because really when you're talking about cultivating leisure, you're really talking about being a thoughtful consumer, how you engage with the world. And I don't know that our larger market wants us to be thoughtful consumers. They want us to be that was a bit of an understatement, wasn't it? I think they want us to be kind of automated and, being able to, and of course, I love to, click on an Amazon book and have it in 2 days, but it does counter against a spirit of leisure that enjoys simple things, as Pope Francis directs us to. It does exacerbate kind of our boredom avoidance tendencies that are deeply problematic.
Sort of like anticipating the book arriving in the mail as opposed to just getting it with the ability to read it on the screen, so yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that by looking at by studying the clicks that we make on the computer, that we are offered things we'll enjoy. I just noticed that maybe a few months ago. I crochet every night, and I kiddingly tell people I crochet because murder is wrong, but anyway, so I'll be crocheting along, and I routinely will look at the places that sell crocheting in case it's a different kind of yarn I'd like to try. I give a lot of the stuff away. And then one day I realized when Mary Maxim and another place I buy yarn from both said, based on your previous shopping experiences.
Yeah.
And I thought, they're tracking me, that's scary.
Yes.
It's not scary for yarn, but it's scary that technology actually exists out there. It's really bizarre.
Yeah. Well, I love the example of crocheting because I have to confess, Cynthia, that it's 20 years ago, I would have looked at that and thought, oh my gosh, that looks so boring. and now I see that and I think, no, actually that's a focal practice. That is something that is very, very, it's not simple. I mean, I would do horrible at it, but it requires a focus and attention, and there's a simplicity to it in terms of the materials and your attention to the yarn.
And the tension at which you're doing anything.
And even
the patterns,
and just sort of the repetition of it, I think about, when you think about cooking, peeling potatoes, the repetition and entering into that is is quite centering, and that's really developing a focal attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very calming. And I've managed, my husband and he picks out the yarn, he picks out the patterns, and then he rolls the yarn. So it's like this group thing or pair thing going between the two of us. And so even though I'm the one sitting with the crochet hook, it's like it really is something that we do together, So it's an interesting thing,
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, it's I was invited by a friend of mine a few years ago to go birding with him.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I grew up learning how to avoid boredom. I was conditioned to that in my family. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, that sounds really boring, staring at birds for 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think, the bored mind can be arrogant and dismissive. And I know I'm wrong, that, to enter into birding is to be in nature. It's to be walking. It's to be seeing. It's to be attending to things. I noticed you have portraits of birds there as I'm looking at your screen.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's these very fundamental practices that Albert Boredom calls focal practices. They seem on the outside to be dull, but in fact, there are these intrinsic goods, and if we enter into them, we can experience them. And that's what, when you think about educating young people, the hope is that they find these kinds of things that they intrinsically enjoy, not because they're trying to compete and win prizes, but because it's cultivating this noble kind of leisure. So
that's true. I enjoy it enormously. I often make clothes for the 18-inch dolls, and then, we'll give the doll and some outfits to somebody that doesn't have a doll or outfits, and it's like, so it's, it's just bizarre how something as simple as holding a piece of yarn between your fingers can result in happiness and peace for one person, a group activity, and something that a child can enjoy.
Yeah.
It's just like your all-purpose leisure, so.
It is. And I think what it has going for it too is, and I talk about this at the very end of the book, is I think the best forms of leisure are Kierkegaard talks about, there's a spirit of love in the process, and being receptive to the love that's there, and it becomes a sacrament, a form of love, a small sacrament, in giving a gift. Cooking a meal is a form of loving our family. Is a form of sacraments. And so cultivating leisure is really just experiencing gratitude for the world we have, and for these wonderful practices that we discover. So
a lot of them give us peace, and peace is something very lacking in this world right now.
Yeah, and it's almost like embarrassingly simple. I mean, I think the bored mind wants things to be more complex, more novel, more interesting. And the key is actually, no, these are very straightforward, simple things that you have to enter into. And Kierkegaard talks about a holy repetition, where you're doing these things over and over, but each time you do them, going back to crocheting, you can enjoy it anew. It's like I've done that before. Each time you go for a walk and you're really present to it, you enjoy it anew. It continues to keep. And so that's also the mystery of embodied leisure. The bored mind is constantly looking for novelty, whereas the leisurely mind recognizes the value in this repetition. So
yeah. So that's it's interesting when you think of it.
Now, I thinking about this in terms of education, I did come across this wonderful article by an art historian. Her name is Joanna Ziegler. She passed away untimely death due to cancer. And she used to teach art classes and really wanted to teach her students about all these great traditions of art, introduce them to all these different artists. And she just found that what she really needed to do was to guide them to behold carefully a painting.
Mm-hmm.
And what she actually required them to do, they would visit a local museum. I think this was in Connecticut, and they had to pick a painting. They had three choices. One was like from the 15th century, I think it was the 19th century, a Monet, and then a contemporary one. And they could pick one of those three. And every week for an hour, they had to go and sit and look at the painting in person. They couldn't look at it on the phone or on a screen. And each week they had to write a 5-page paper, and it had to begin with "Now I see," and they would describe in detail.
Mm-hmm.
And, she reports back that initially the students were, several were quite perturbed by this assignment. Like, how dare you require me to go someplace to see? But over time, there were students that really came to appreciate the painting, and they really came to own it. Like, this was my painting. They knew every line, every texture.
Mm-hmm.
Process, what was happening was they were becoming beholders. They were becoming people of leisure who can, oftentimes you go into an art museum, people are good at identifying the art, but what she was really about was, are we actually seeing the art? Are we taking the time to see the art? And so in terms of education, I always found that to be a very daring and impressive example of cultivating, this kind of deep leisure and seeing and beholding. So,
yeah, that's interesting.
yeah.
Oh, now I'm going to have to go do that. I'm going to have to go sit in a museum and do that, because I never thought of it before. That sounds like something that would really be eye-opening.
Yeah. Of course, pedagogically, when I think about students, I think we have to be careful not to, push too far, but even saying, just take 10 minutes, put your phone off and just observe and behold. And to kind of, it's really building up kind of sort of these muscles that have atrophied
in this culture. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to try for an hour for myself. Just sit there and look. It's, to be receptive to something is really, maybe that's a skill we need to develop more.
Yeah, and I think we can come at it through all these different kinds of activities: crocheting, going for a walk. I mentioned birding, going to painting. Each of these ways that demand sort of full-bodied engagement and holding is, and it really does push against the bored mind, which is really characterized by an inability to attend carefully. Bored, we just can't really sit with what it is that's there, and so we then miss possibilities that might be there. The one connection I didn't mention earlier was in the early church, spiritual writers, and I'm thinking of Evagrius especially. They described the ancient precursor to boredom as acedia, which sometimes gets described as the noonday devil. We're bored. We're vulnerable to all kinds of temptation, and so in the book, I'm connecting to this classical wisdom as well as contemporary understanding, because I really think the problem of boredom, while it's been exacerbated by modern conditions, it's a problem that has been with us a long time. There's variants of it in Ecclesiastes where there's this sort of, what's the point of life? What's the purpose of everything? And so it really does pull a thread that draws across time, and there have been many great insights over time about it.
That's interesting. In fact, that the book itself, I think, if enough people read it, or if people read it, which I'm hoping they will, you could have a real impact on people especially if you're dealing with parents of young children. I never really thought of leisure. I mean, I've thought of leisure, but not in the kind of detail you're talking about. And, it's really something that could aid this culture and, aid young children. And as they grow up and teach theirs, it could make people think. That to me is part of the problem. So many just kind of like go through life and they don't think about things very deeply.
Yeah.
But you've taken one word, and one word, and written a book about it. And I think that's something that, if people really started to think about and read, it could have a big influence on people.
Yeah, my kids are really tired of me talking about boredom, as you can imagine. But it's, the complaint, I'm bored. There's kind of I'm bored. You need to solve this problem for me. And there's that miseducation happens where children are bored and the adults then have to helicopter in and provide, some kind of solution. And that's sort of the knee-jerk response that we're all prone to. I mean, we can hardly make a drive across the country without having everything charged up with videos. And when you and I were kids, we had long car rides and we were just to our own
out the window. Yeah,
at the window. Counting which states do you see on license plates. And
yes, I remember that well.
Yeah. So as parents, there's challenging our children to find ways really to make meaning and to find these focal practices that can imbue their time with meaning and interest. Instead, we give them a device, and that device pretty much lays everything out for them to keep avoiding the boredom and avoiding then cultivating the kind of leisure that I'm talking about. So
good point. So I have to congratulate you on coming up with this.
Oh, thank you, Cynthia.
And I really do hope that it has some influence.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to have it done. Staring down the room is daunting. It was daunting writing. But
sure.
I had some great friends. Shout out to my friend Doug Yasik and Mark Jonas, and most importantly, my wife Heather Gary, who were companions helping me bring this to fruition. So
that's good.
Yeah,
that's good. Okay, so
three bored children, Evie, Lucas, and Gabe, who were my guinea pigs that I could do trials on. So
I understand better than you believe. Anyway, so thank you very much for this. I've found it to be very interesting information.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah,
and you present very well. I mean, I'm able to follow everything you said, and I think that most people can. Because when you don't think about something in great detail and then someone's going to talk about it for an hour, it's like, okay, I get lost here. But you're thorough and you're really organized. So I enjoy it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I've had a lot of time to think about it. So thank you so much. And I really did enjoy just delving into several. You've done a number of these. So it's great. Quite a trove of
almost 200 now. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I consider it my ministry because I want people to know about good Catholic literature in many genres. I remember going into Barnes and Noble one day, and I was walking by the religion shelves, and it was like, "Whoa, what is this stuff?" It's the antithesis of my religion, but so really, when Sebastian gave me the opportunity to do interviews, I thought this is really good because if people have an interest and they want to know something, I mean, sometimes it's children's books or it's history or it's biography or I'm a memoirist, so so all these different genres, but there's something that can attract people there. They can say, okay, this book has kind of been vetted, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I consider it a ministry. So
yeah,
almost 200.
Well, I'm envious. What an amazing job you have. That's gee whiz. Yeah.
It's fun. Yeah, it really is. Meet a lot of smart people, interesting people. Think about things you never would have thought of. It's great.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, if you write anything else, or if you've written something in the past that you'd like me to interview you on, just let me know.
Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. You too.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.